In the 90s, our friends in Stuttgart had been moving back into endurance racing for the first time in a goodly while. Partnering with chassis constructor Sauber on the somewhat middling C8 and the rather excellent C9, before finally putting their name on the car with the C11, which replaced the C9 after its dominant 1989 season. Simultaneously, Mercedes road cars were arguably at the apex of their reputation for quality and over-engineering, and they decided to explore one of their few non-occupied aspirational markets, the fairly new market segment of luxury supercar. Not dissimilar to how Porsche had approached the Gruppe B /959/961 project, Mercedes decided to tie the new car in with their motorsport projects. But unlike the Gruppe B or their future efforts in GT1, there were no homologation requirements for Group C, and thus the tie-ins could be more surface and brand level than mechanically exacting. So, Mercedes proceeded with designing more of a companion model for the road rather than rebuilding their race car for the road, but you know what? That was probably for the best. Why? Well, the C11, like all the Group C cars, was optimized for fuel efficiency, which didn't exactly leave a lot of room for creature comforts or, cabin space for a proper passenger. To be fair, if they'd been only optimized for top speed like the GTPs and IMSA at the time, it still wouldn't have been any better. The C11 was powered by a highly tuned version of Mercedes' M119 V8, displacing 5 liters and with a couple of KKK turbos that, when running at high boost pressures, could get 850 horsepower from the engine at 7,000 RPM and bring a fantastic soundtrack to go with it. The new chassis and suspension for the C11 versus the C9 was substantially stiffer, and it generated oodles of downforce. Again, not great for adaptation into a road car. So instead, they took the general concepts of designing a Group C prototype and built a road car using those principles, while also integrating some of the experimental testbed mindset that they had embraced with the C111. This time focusing on dynamic ride control systems and aerodynamics rather than primarily on the power plants. The racing twin-turbo V8 was replaced with an even larger but much more civilized M120 naturally aspirated V12, Mercedes' first road-going production V12 that would later go on to power the CLK GTR and Pagani's Zonda in somewhat larrier forms. This engine produced a comparatively paltry 408 horsepower, but 427 pound-feet of torque that went to the rear wheels through a 6-speed manual gearbox. These mechanicals were mounted, instead of in a carbon tub as in the C11, in an ultralight, 130 pounds or about 59 kgs, bonded aluminum monocoque that also featured an integrated steel roll cage for safety. Bodywork was aluminum and Kevlar instead of carbon and Kevlar, but there was still complicated rear aero, including a big rear, technically a diffuser. Unlike more modern race car diffusers, these just look like pretty large Venturi tunnels, rather than anything with a lot of strakes and finials and so on. Stopping power came from Brembo ventilated disc brakes and 4-pot calipers on all 4 wheels, but that was about the last of the elements that could be more or less tied to Group C racing technology, because, Mercedes had the bit between their teeth at this point, and they just kept going on the what things can we add to it motif, integrating an active spoiler under the front bumper to improve downforce, which could reportedly hit about 2,200 pounds or 1 metric ton, so still quite considerable at the car's top speed of 192 miles an hour. With 0 to 62 miles an hour, or 0 to 100 kph, estimated at 4.9 seconds, although that supposes that one can trust Mercedes' official estimates, which in my experience have typically been a bit modest. In a nod to their first great road-going racer turned supercar, the 300 SL, gull-wing doors were the order of the day, the rear wing lifted to augment stopping power and hark back to the 300 SLR, and they made sure to trim the interior with a bunch of parts lifted from the range-topping S-classes. Although since this was the early 90s, that does unfortunately still mean some slightly plasticky leather and other bits. What else did we have? They also built in active rear wheel steering, controlled electronically rather than using a passive setup like the VSOC axle that Porsche were using on the 928. And the car also debuted ABC, active body control, which was Mercedes and I think the world's first active suspension system for well, in this case, a prototype, but later to debut on their production cars. The car was constructed and ready to debut at the Frankfurt Motor Show in 1991, where Mercedes touted it as a production-ready sports car that blended Group C technology with safety and road-friendly driving dynamics, which is a better mix than they would be able to later claim with the CLK GTR Strassenversion. And to the great joy of the better-heeled motor show attendees, Mercedes was even taking deposits against a production run of the car. They reportedly received more than 700 commitments, including some essentially blank checks, but the man who had overseen the car's construction, Werner Niefer, was no longer with the company after some questionable/unfortunate activities, and the new Mercedes leadership decided that they didn't need a supercar, and thus canned the project before the second vehicle, a development model to refine the design for production, could be completed. The world would have to wait until the end of the decade before they could get their hands on a Mercedes V12-powered race car for the road, and arguably until 1999 for something that was actually usable, which finally came in the form of the Zonda. There are some reports that indicate that Mercedes wasn't actually taking deposits, and it was just that they fielded a lot of offers, but reports vary, and we're, again, just going with what I saw more frequently reported. For our final car, we're keeping it with Mercedes and heading back to what can only be called their Annus Horribilis, 1955.